August 1950. The Korean War was barely 2 months old, and the United States and South Korean forces were losing badly. The North Korean People's Army had swept down the peninsula like a tidal wave, crushing everything in its path. Seoul had fallen in 3 days. The South Korean army had disintegrated. American units rushed into combat straight from occupation duty in Japan were being mauled by battle-hardened North Korean troops equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery. By early August, all that remained of South Korea was a rectangular defensive perimeter around the port city of Pusan in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. The Pusan Perimeter was roughly 50 miles wide and 100 miles long. A tiny piece of land that represented the last stand for South Korea and American forces in the theater. If the Pusan Perimeter fell, South Korea would cease to exist. The North Koreans would control the entire peninsula, achieving their goal of reunification under communist rule. American forces would suffer a humiliating defeat, losing their first hot war of the Cold War era. The strategic implications would be enormous, potentially encouraging communist expansion across Asia. Everything depended on holding the Pusan Perimeter long enough for reinforcements to arrive and for the United Nations to organize a counteroffensive. But in August 1950, it wasn't clear that the perimeter could hold. North Korean forces were attacking along the entire perimeter, probing for weaknesses, massing for major assaults designed to break through and capture Pusan itself. The 27th Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Wolfhounds, had been fighting continuously since arriving in Korea in July. The regiment had been in Japan on occupation duty when the war started, and they were rushed to Korea with minimal preparation. Most of the soldiers were young, with little combat experience. Their equipment was adequate, but not overwhelming. Their training had focused on occupation duties, not combat operations. And they found themselves facing North Korean troops who were veterans of the Chinese Civil War, experienced soldiers who knew how to fight and who had excellent equipment provided by the Soviet Union. In mid-August, the 27th Infantry was holding a section of the Pusan Perimeter northwest of the city. The terrain was mountainous, covered with rice paddies in the valleys and scrub vegetation on the slopes. Roads were primitive, making supply difficult. Communications were spotty at best. The regiment was stretched thin, with battalions holding fronts that would normally require entire regiments. Every position was critical. If any position fell, North Korean forces could pour through the gap and threaten the entire defensive line. One of these critical positions was a hill designated on American maps simply as Hill 257, named for its elevation in meters. The hill overlooked a key road junction and commanded the surrounding terrain. Whoever held Hill 257 could observe and control movement for miles in all directions. The 27th Infantry's 2nd Battalion was ordered to take and hold Hill 257 at all costs. Fox Company, about 500 men, got the assignment. They moved onto the hill, dug in, and prepared for the inevitable North Korean attack. What they didn't know was that they were about to be cut off and surrounded for 5 days, fighting with no resupply, no reinforcements, and no way out. The stand they would make on that hill would buy critical time for the Pusan Perimeter, but the cost would be paid in blood and suffering that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Fox Company had been on Hill 257 for less than 24 hours when the North Koreans attacked. The attack came at night, the preferred time for North Korean operations. Mortars and artillery began falling on American positions, heavy concentrations that tore apart foxholes and fighting positions. Then came the infantry, moving up the slopes in company strength formations, firing as they came, shouting and blowing bugles to create confusion and fear. The Americans opened fire with everything they had: rifles, machine guns, mortars, calling for artillery support from batteries positioned miles to the rear. The first attack was repulsed, but at a cost. Fox Company took casualties, including several key leaders. Ammunition expenditure had been heavy. The wounded needed evacuation, but the battalion aid station was at the base of the hill, and moving wounded men down the hill under fire was dangerous and time-consuming. Captain James Mitchell, commanding Fox Company, radioed battalion headquarters requesting resupply and medical evacuation. The response was not encouraging. North Korean forces had infiltrated around the American positions. The road to Hill 257 had been cut. No vehicles could get through. Fox Company was on its own until the road could be reopened. Mitchell assessed his situation. He had about 500 men, though some were wounded and combat effectiveness was already reduced. He had ammunition for maybe 2 more major firefights before running critically low. He had some sea rations and water, but not enough for an extended siege. He had no anti-tank weapons heavy enough to deal with North Korean T-34 tanks if they showed up. And he had wounded men who needed medical attention beyond what the company medics could provide. The situation was not good. But Mitchell had his orders: hold the hill. So that's what Fox Company would do. The second attack came the next morning. This time, the North Koreans tried a different approach, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously to split the American defense. Mitchell repositioned his men, thinning out some sectors to reinforce others, gambling that the North Koreans wouldn't find the weak points. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed, then switched to alternate weapons while the hot barrels cooled. Riflemen aimed carefully, making every shot count, knowing that ammunition couldn't be wasted. Mortar crews fired until they were down to their last dozen rounds, then stopped to save ammunition for the most critical moments. The attack was beaten off, but Fox Company's ammunition situation was now critical. Mitchell ordered an ammunition inventory. The results were grim. Most riflemen had less than 1 full magazine remaining. Machine gun ammunition was down to a few hundred rounds per gun. Mortar ammunition was almost exhausted. Artillery support from the rear was available, but friendly artillery couldn't help if North Korean troops got into close combat with the Americans. Fox Company needed small arms ammunition, and they needed it soon. But the road was still cut, and battalion couldn't send supplies through. Mitchell made a decision that would prove critical to Fox Company's survival. He ordered his men to police the battlefield and collect ammunition from dead North Korean soldiers. The North Koreans used Soviet weapons, and their ammunition wasn't compatible with American weapons. But their grenades worked fine, and any supplies the North Koreans had could be used by the Americans. Patrols crawled out into no man's land under cover of darkness, searching bodies for anything useful. They found ammunition, grenades, food, water, and medical supplies. It wasn't much, but it helped. Fox Company was learning to survive on what they could scavenge from their enemies. By the third day, Fox Company was in serious trouble. Wounded men were piling up in the company command post, a depression near the top of the hill that offered some protection from fire. The medics had run out of morphine, bandages, and plasma. Wounded men were in terrible pain, and the medics could do little more than make them comfortable. Water was running low despite efforts to collect rainwater in ponchos and helmets. Food was rationed to 1 sea ration can per man per day, barely enough to maintain strength. And the North Koreans kept attacking, probing for weaknesses, trying to find a way to break through the American defenses and take the hill. Mitchell sent increasingly desperate radio messages to battalion. His men were holding, but they couldn't hold indefinitely without resupply. The wounded needed evacuation. The unit needed ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. Battalion kept promising that relief was coming, that a convoy would break through soon, that airdrops were being organized. But nothing arrived. The road remained cut. North Korean forces controlled the surrounding terrain, and Fox Company remained isolated on Hill 257, fighting alone, wondering if anyone was coming to help them, or if they had been written off as lost. The fourth day on Hill 257 began with another North Korean attack, this one the heaviest yet. The North Koreans had brought up reinforcements and were determined to take the hill. They attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, supported by heavy mortar fire that walked across American positions, exploding in foxholes and fighting positions, killing and wounding defenders. The Americans fought back desperately, knowing that if the North Koreans broke through, everyone on the hill would be killed or captured. Sergeant First Class William Richardson commanded a machine gun section on the eastern side of the perimeter. His position had been under continuous fire all morning, and he had lost half his gun crews to casualties. Richardson moved from gun to gun, keeping them firing, replacing casualties with men pulled from other positions, making sure every gun had ammunition. When one gun took a direct hit from a mortar round, killing the entire crew, Richardson personally manned the gun, firing until North Korean troops broke off their attack and withdrew. His actions held that section of the perimeter and earned him a Silver Star, though he would say later that he was just doing his job. By midday on the fourth day, Fox Company was reduced to about 350 effectives. Over 150 men were casualties, killed or wounded. The wounded were crowded into the command post area, lying on the ground, some delirious from pain and infection, all of them needing medical attention that couldn't be provided. The medics did what they could with almost no supplies. They reused bandages after washing them in collected rainwater. They used strips of cloth torn from uniforms when bandages ran out. They held hands with dying men and told them help was coming, even when they knew it probably wasn't. Captain Mitchell was approaching physical and mental exhaustion. He hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time in 4 days. He was trying to command the defense, take care of his wounded, maintain morale, and somehow find a way to keep his company combat effective for one more day. He knew the situation was unsustainable. Every attack cost casualties Fox Company couldn't replace. Ammunition was nearly exhausted despite scavenging from the battlefield. Food and water were almost gone. The men were at the limit of their endurance. Something had to break soon, and Mitchell was terrified it would be his company. That afternoon, an airdrop was attempted. A single Air Force transport flew over Hill 257 and dropped supply bundles by parachute. The drop was rushed and poorly coordinated. Most bundles landed outside the perimeter in North Korean-controlled territory. The North Koreans, not the Americans, got most of the supplies. Only 2 bundles landed within American lines, and one of those landed on a wounded man, killing him. The bundle contained medical supplies, which were desperately needed. But the death of the wounded man was a cruel price to pay. The botched airdrop was demoralizing. Fox Company felt abandoned, forgotten, left to die on a hill that nobody seemed to care about. The 5th day dawned with rain, cold rain that soaked through uniforms and turned foxholes into muddy pools. The men were shivering, exhausted, hungry, and at the absolute limit of endurance. Mitchell knew they couldn't hold much longer. One more major attack might break them. He gathered his remaining officers and senior NCOs and told them the situation. If the North Koreans attacked again in force, Fox Company might not be able to hold. Every man would fight to the end, but they had to be realistic about their chances. The officers and NCOs understood. They went back to their positions and told their men what to expect. The men accepted it quietly. They had done everything possible. If this was the end, they would go down fighting. But that afternoon, everything changed. Artillery fire began falling on North Korean positions around the hill, heavy concentrations that devastated the enemy. American tanks appeared on the road below, firing their main guns at North Korean positions, blasting apart machine gun nests and mortar positions. Infantry from another battalion advanced up the road, fighting through North Korean resistance, moving toward Hill 257. The relief force had finally broken through. Fox Company, after 5 days of isolated combat, was about to be rescued. When the relief force reached Hill 257 late on the afternoon of the 5th day, they found a scene that shocked even combat veterans. The hill was littered with bodies, both American and North Korean. Destroyed equipment lay everywhere. The stench of death was overwhelming. And the survivors of Fox Company looked like walking corpses. They were filthy, exhausted, hollow-eyed, many of them wounded. Some could barely stand. They had been pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance, and it showed in every face. Captain Mitchell met the relief force commander and gave a brief situation report. Fox Company had started with 500 men. They now had about 250 combat effectives and over 150 casualties, killed or wounded. They had held the hill for 5 days against continuous attacks. They had fought with almost no ammunition, no supplies, no support. But they had held. The hill was still in American hands. The road junction was still controlled. The mission had been accomplished, though at a terrible cost. The wounded were evacuated immediately, loaded onto jeeps and trucks, and driven to the rear where proper medical facilities could treat them. Some of the wounded had been lying untreated for days. Infections had set in. Some wounds had become gangrenous. A few of the wounded would die despite finally receiving medical attention, their bodies simply too damaged to recover. Others would survive but carry the physical and psychological scars of Hill 257 for the rest of their lives. Fox Company was pulled off the line and sent to the rear for rest and reconstitution. They needed replacements, resupply, and time to recover from their ordeal. But the Korean War didn't allow much time for rest. Within days, Fox Company would be back on the line, fighting in another desperate defensive position, holding another piece of the Pusan Perimeter against North Korean attacks. The war went on, and there were never enough troops to hold the line without using everyone available. The stand on Hill 257 was not unique. Across the Pusan Perimeter in August and early September 1950, dozens of similar desperate stands took place. American and South Korean units, outnumbered and outgunned, held positions that should have been overrun. They fought with minimal supplies, took horrific casualties, and somehow held on just long enough for reinforcements to arrive or for the North Koreans to exhaust themselves. Each stand bought time. Each stand prevented a breakthrough that could have collapsed the entire perimeter. And collectively, these stands saved South Korea. By mid-September, the situation had changed dramatically. American reinforcements had poured into Pusan. The 8th Army had reorganized and strengthened its defenses. And General MacArthur had launched the Incheon landing, an amphibious assault far behind North Korean lines that cut their supply lines and forced them to retreat. The North Korean army, which had seemed invincible in June and July, was suddenly in full retreat, being chased back north by the same American and South Korean forces it had nearly destroyed. The Pusan Perimeter had held, barely, bought time with blood and courage, and turned the war around. Fox Company's stand on Hill 257 became one small part of that larger story. They were one unit among many, fighting one battle among hundreds, holding one hill among dozens that had to be held. But for the 500 men who fought on that hill, and especially for the 150 who became casualties, it was the defining experience of their lives. They had been surrounded, cut off, abandoned, left to die on a nameless hill in a war most Americans didn't understand. But they had held. They had done their duty. They had proven that American soldiers, even when outnumbered and undersupplied, could stand and fight and win. The Korean War would continue for 3 more years, eventually ending in stalemate and armistice rather than clear victory. The Pusan Perimeter would be remembered as the low point of the war, when everything hung in the balance and could have gone either way. And battles like Hill 257 would be remembered as examples of why the perimeter held, not because of brilliant strategy or overwhelming firepower, but because of soldiers who refused to quit, who held their positions despite impossible odds, who bought time with their lives so that others could prepare the counteroffensive that would save South Korea. 500 soldiers surrounded on a hill, fighting for 5 days with no supplies, holding until relief arrived. That's what saved the Pusan Perimeter. That's what turned the war around. And that's why we still remember Hill 257 and the men who fought there.